What if I tell you that the reason you are not wealthy yet has nothing to do with your education, your job, your family background, or even the economy, but everything to do with the silent words you repeat to yourself when no one else is listening? Because Neville Goddard taught that the inner conversation is the true creative act, and while you may spend hours visualizing or affirming, if your secret dialogue still says things like "money never stays with me," or "I just can't get ahead," then those words become the invisible blueprint that your outer world must obey, shaping circumstances that match your assumptions in ways so subtle that you mistake them for coincidence. Yet in truth, they are nothing more than echoes of the chatter you allowed to run freely within you. And if you pause for a moment and think about how often you replay the same thoughts, you'll realize that these inner conversations have become so habitual that they operate like a background program, always running, always whispering doubts or fears, always confirming your identity as someone struggling with money. And because imagination is creation, these whispers are orders given to the universe that must be fulfilled. The power is not in the loud affirmations you say once or twice, but in the quiet inner responses you carry to every situation. When you see a bill, when you hear about someone else's success, when you want something expensive, what do you say to yourself in that split second? If it is, "I'll never manage," or "they're lucky I'm not," or "it's too hard," then you have already decided your fate in that moment, even if you later try to convince yourself with positive words. Neville's genius was in showing us that we don't need to fight the outside world or beg circumstances to change. Instead, we only need to master the invisible inner talk that creates the outer picture. And that mastery begins with becoming aware of what you have been ignoring. Imagine the difference if every time you faced a challenge, your inner voice simply replied, "Of course I always have enough," or "wealth comes naturally to me," and you kept that tone alive. Not as a desperate affirmation, but as a natural inner assumption of your being. Wealth would no longer be something you chase, but something that feels inevitable. And the shift would not come from outside, but from the conversations you silently rehearse within. This is why Neville said, "Imagination is the only reality," because whatever you consistently accept in imagination, especially through the words you tell yourself, must harden into fact. And until you change the private dialogue, the public story will remain the same. That is the secret most people ignore. The hidden key that makes all the difference. And once you grasp it, you can never again blame the world for your lack. Because you will know that the only conversation that matters is the one you are having with yourself in the quiet moments. And now, as we go deeper, let us explore how this unseen dialogue, often overlooked, has been silently sabotaging your financial destiny, not in a way that condemns you, but in a way that reveals exactly how to rewrite your entire story from the inside out. Because the wealth you are seeking is already waiting for the right words to unlock it. You may not realize it, but the law you are living under is not the law of attraction, as many people have diluted it into catchy slogans, but the law of assumption, as Neville Goddard revealed. Because attraction implies waiting for something outside to come toward you, while assumption demands that you become the thing you desire in imagination first, and then watch the world rearrange to match it. And this is where most people miss the point and keep themselves in lack without even noticing it. The inner conversation you ignore every day is not just idle talk, it is assumption in motion, because when you silently tell yourself, "I can't afford this," or "money is so hard to get," you are not just describing your state, you are assuming poverty as your identity, and once assumed, it must be expressed. That is why people try affirmations for weeks, see no change, and conclude it doesn't work, when in fact their true assumptions never shifted, because they kept carrying the identity of the struggler in their private dialogue. If you believe in the law of attraction alone, you end up hoping, waiting, and checking the outside world for signs, but Neville's law of assumption cuts deeper, because it tells you to stop waiting for proof and to assume right now that wealth is already yours, regardless of appearances. This is why Neville would say to live in the end, because if in your inner talk you are already wealthy, you will unconsciously begin to walk, speak, and act as wealth itself. and the outer world has no choice but to conform to your conviction. Think of how liberating this is, because instead of waiting for luck, chance, or a miracle, you realize that the miracle is your decision to accept a new assumption about yourself. And once accepted, it will solidify into your everyday experience. Yet here is the trap. You cannot keep two opposing conversations alive, saying I am rich in the morning and then I'm broke at night, because the stronger inner dialogue will always dominate, and usually it is the negative one you repeat without thinking. So the invitation here is to watch your own self-talk, not just in meditation, but in the ordinary moments, because those small responses are assumptions that lock your future in place. Imagine catching yourself before you say, I can't afford that, and instead assuming it always works out for me, because in that instant, you are choosing a new self, a new state, a new law to operate under. And once you understand this, you stop being a beggar to circumstances and start being a master of assumption, which is the true secret to wealth that Neville left behind for those willing to listen. And so as this story unfolds further, you will begin to see how these assumptions, clothed in simple inner conversations, are the invisible bridges to your wealth, if only you dare to walk across them without waiting for proof. You may think imagination is a childish pastime reserved for dreamers, but Neville Goddard insisted that imagination is the only reality, because everything you see around you right now first existed in the unseen realm of thought. And until you grasp that fact, you will continue to believe that money is earned only through effort, connections, or luck, when in truth it is your imaginal activity that shapes the very conditions you call real. When you constantly picture yourself as someone who is always short of cash, always behind on bills, always struggling to catch up, you are not simply worrying, you are imagining. And imagination is creation, which means those repeated inner pictures and dialogues are the very seeds that grow into your so-called bad luck. But when you deliberately enter the state of the wish fulfilled and imagine yourself already living in abundance, even if your senses scream the opposite, you have planted a seed that must bring forth fruit in its season, and the outer world has no choice but to comply, because imagination is not fantasy, it is causation. This is why Neville urged us to see the end clearly and to persist in it until the feeling of reality takes hold, for it is that inner conviction that silently orders the universe to move people, events, and circumstances into alignment. Consider for a moment how often you imagine negative outcomes without even realizing it, rehearsing conversations where you explain why you can't pay, replaying scenarios of embarrassment when money runs out, picturing delays and failures before they even happen, and then watch how life seems to echo back exactly what you feared. That is not coincidence, that is creation. And until you become the master of your imagination, you remain the servant of your unguarded thoughts. But once you take control, once you dare to imagine prosperity as your normal state, and once you let that inner picture dominate your inner world, the external world bends to match it with uncanny precision. This is not about daydreaming. It is about assuming the truth of what you desire so completely in imagination that your senses eventually confirm it as fact, and this shift is the real work behind wealth. Think of it as building a bridge of incidents. The imaginal act creates the end, and life arranges the steps between where you are and where you must be, often in ways you could never have planned. The question then is not whether imagination works, but whether you will discipline yourself to use it constructively. For it is always working, whether toward wealth or toward lack. And so the journey deepens, because if imagination is always creating, then the wealth you are seeking is already within your grasp, the moment you dare to accept it in your inner world. And from that acceptance, the outer world must obey, quietly proving that your ignored inner conversation was the missing key all along. You might not realize how much power you give away to your past mistakes, but Neville Goddard taught that the past is not fixed, and that the technique of revision allows you to change it in imagination so thoroughly that your subconscious accepts the new version as truth. And once accepted, your life begins to shift to reflect it, even financially. Think about the times you failed in money matters, perhaps a bad investment, a job you lost, or a bill you couldn't pay on time. And notice how those memories still whisper in your inner conversations today, convincing you that you are unlucky, that you always make bad choices, or that wealth is beyond your reach. Every time you replay those scenes and say to yourself, "I always mess up," you are strengthening an assumption of poverty, and until you revise those stories, they remain active commands shaping your future. But imagine taking that very memory, closing your eyes, and replaying it in imagination differently, seeing yourself successful in that investment, hearing good news instead of rejection, feeling the relief of paying the bill with ease, and then allowing that new version to overwrite the old one in your subconscious mind. Neville insisted that what you accept in imagination is far more real than what your senses reported, because the senses only confirm the assumptions you already carried. And if you dare to revise, you liberate yourself from the chains of old failures. This is not denial, it is creative reauthoring, because the only reason you struggle with money now is that your inner conversations are saturated with past defeats that you never edited. The beauty of revision is that it does not only heal the memory, it also changes how you feel about yourself in the present. And when you walk with a new inner confidence, life begins to present opportunities that reflect that healed version of you. Imagine the freedom of no longer dragging the weight of yesterday's financial mistakes into every new opportunity, but instead walking into each moment with the assumption that you always succeed, you always choose wisely, and money flows to you with ease. When you live from revised memories, your inner conversation naturally shifts, because you no longer call yourself a struggler. You silently affirm, "I always rise, I always prosper, I always have enough." And those words become the soil in which new wealth is planted. It is in this way that the inner work of revision erases not just the sting of the past, but the curse of repeating it, freeing you to assume wealth as your natural destiny. And so, as you move further, you begin to realize that the past you thought was fixed is only a story you have been repeating, and by changing that story in imagination, you change the very future you are walking into, proving once again that the inner conversation is the hidden author of your financial life. You may have heard countless times that thoughts become things, but Neville Goddard made it clear that it is not the thought alone that creates, but the feeling that fuses with it, because feeling is the secret. And unless you clothe your inner conversations with the emotion of certainty and relief, they remain empty words with no power to manifest wealth. You can repeat affirmations like, "I am rich," all day long, but if deep down you still feel anxious, doubtful, or desperate, the subconscious does not hear the words. It hears the vibration of lack behind them, and so it continues to outpicture more lack. The secret, then, is not to force wealth with empty phrases, but to sink into the mood of already being wealthy, to allow yourself to feel the satisfaction, ease, and freedom of abundance until your body and mind accept it as normal. Neville would say that assumption is an act of faith clothed in feeling, and without the clothing, the assumption cannot walk into reality, which is why so many people give up after a few days of trying and declare that nothing works. But the ones who persist until the feeling takes root, until the inner conversation is not just a sentence, but a living atmosphere of wealth, find themselves surrounded by opportunities and circumstances that mirror that inner climate. Think of the difference between saying, "I am rich," while feeling tense, and saying it while letting your shoulders drop, your breath slow, and your imagination embrace the calm assurance that it is already done. The latter sinks into the subconscious, the former bounces off like noise. Feeling is the language of the subconscious, and once it accepts a new state, it does not argue, it simply reorganizes your world to match. This is why Neville encouraged people to practice entering the state akin to sleep, because in that drowsy state the feeling of reality sinks deeper, bypassing the objections of logic and planting itself in the fertile soil of the subconscious. When you fall asleep, imagining yourself wealthy and feeling the comfort of it, you are watering the seed of wealth every night, and by day you begin to carry the fragrance of that assumption in every conversation and decision. The outer world, sensing your inner certainty, responds in kind, as if wealth were magnetized to you, not because you chased it, but because you became it in feeling first. And so, as we move forward, you begin to see that the missing link has never been effort, hard work, or constant chasing, but the subtle art of saturating your inner conversations with the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Because once you master that, wealth ceases to be a struggle and becomes the inevitable reflection of your inner state. You may not be aware of it, but the poverty you experience on the outside is often nothing more than the echo of a hidden script you have been running on the inside for years. A script so familiar that you hardly notice it anymore, and yet it is this constant background dialogue that keeps recreating the same financial struggles over and over again. Whenever you mutter silently to yourself, "I can't afford that," or "money always runs out," or "life is hard," you are not merely complaining, you are affirming an identity. You are assuming lack as your truth. And the subconscious, which accepts every assumption you persist in, keeps presenting you with situations that validate those words. Neville Goddard warned that what you consent to inwardly will harden into fact outwardly. And this is exactly why people who call themselves broke remain broke, because their inner conversations are loyal to poverty, even while their lips speak of wanting riches. The tragedy is that this script does not even feel like a choice anymore. It feels like reality. But in truth, it is only a pattern of inner speech that has never been challenged. If you stop and listen to yourself for a single day, you will notice how many of your inner responses default to struggle. When a bill arrives, when you see something you desire, when someone else succeeds. And each of these micro-conversations is like a brushstroke painting the larger picture of your financial life. And yet, just as a bad script can keep you trapped, a new script can liberate you. Because if you deliberately replace those hidden lines with inner words of abundance, the subconscious will eventually accept them, and the play of your life will unfold differently. Imagine for a moment what would happen if every time you saw something expensive, instead of sighing, "I'll never have that," you softly assumed, "It's easy for me to have what I want," and let that new script play until it became second nature. Soon enough, the outer world would begin to echo back opportunities, surprises, and alignments that prove your inner dialogue has changed. Because wealth is not drawn to desperation, but to the confidence of assumption. This is why Neville insisted that your inner talking must be controlled and redirected. For without awareness, you are constantly hypnotizing yourself into poverty. But the moment you rewrite the lines of your hidden play, you step out of the role of the struggler and into the role of the wealthy one. And life, being the faithful mirror it is, reflects that new character without hesitation. And so, as you keep journeying through this truth, you begin to see that wealth is not about forcing conditions, but about silencing the old poverty script and rehearsing a new, wealthy dialogue until it becomes your unquestioned identity. For once you live from that script, the world must perform accordingly. You may not see it at first, but every complaint you make, whether spoken aloud or whispered silently in your mind, is like a seed planted in the soil of your imagination. And because Neville Goddard taught that imagination creates reality, those seeds must eventually sprout into circumstances that echo the very complaints you keep rehearsing. When you say, "I never have enough," or "life is so unfair," you are not just venting frustration. You are giving shape to an inner conversation that convinces your subconscious to prepare more evidence of lack for you to experience. Because the subconscious does not distinguish between what is said in jest, in anger, or in despair. It only hears the assumption and accepts it as law. Complaining feels harmless because it is so common, but what most people don't realize is that every complaint reinforces the identity of a struggler, and the world faithfully reflects that identity by delivering more reasons to complain. If you look closely, you'll see that people who always complain about bills, about the economy, about rich people, or about their jobs, somehow keep experiencing the same cycles of frustration. Not because fate is cruel, but because their inner dialogue never left the arena of lack. Neville showed us that even casual talk is creative, and the more emotionally charged the complaint, the faster it takes root, because feeling is the secret, and complaints are soaked in feelings of resentment, fear, and disappointment. The irony is that complaining feels like releasing tension, But in reality, it chains you tighter to the very situation you want to escape, because your inner speech keeps replaying the problem rather than assuming the solution. Imagine instead if, in the very moment when you are tempted to complain, you silently shifted your inner voice to gratitude, or to the quiet assumption that all things are working out in your favor, because that new conversation would plant different seeds of abundance, opportunity, and unexpected ease. The difference between the wealthy mindset and the poverty mindset is not luck. It is the discipline of inner speech, because those who prosper often carry an inner climate of calm expectancy rather than constant complaint. This is why Neville urged his students to practice self-observation, to catch themselves in mid-sentence and revise the inner talk before it hardened into fact. The choice is always there. Repeat the complaint and multiply lack, or replace it with assumption and multiply wealth. And as you continue to awaken to this truth, you begin to realize that the end of complaint is the beginning of creation. And when you choose to let your inner conversations sing of abundance, instead of sigh about problems, you step into the current of wealth that has been waiting for you all along. You may not notice how often you do it, but every time you compare yourself to someone else who appears wealthier, luckier, or more successful, you are silently affirming that they have what you do not. And in doing so, you cement the assumption of lack in your own imagination, which is why Neville Goddard warned that to envy or compare is to confess your own poverty. When you scroll through social media and think, they have the life I'll never reach, or when you look at a colleague and mutter inwardly, they always get ahead while I stay stuck, you are not just observing, you are scripting. And your subconscious hears that inner conversation as an order to keep you in the very state you are lamenting. Comparisons kill wealth because they place the spotlight outside yourself, making you a spectator rather than a creator. And in that moment, you deny the truth that imagination creates reality from within. Neville insisted that you must live in the end of your own desire, not in the shadow of someone else's story, because to assume the role of the observer of their wealth is to ignore the truth of your own power. Think about it. When you admire someone else's abundance and say to yourself, I wish I had that, you are affirming distance between you and the thing desired. Whereas when you imagine yourself already possessing it, you erase the gap and bring it into your present state. The outer world then reflects that assumption back. But it cannot do so while your inner conversation is laced with comparisons, jealousy, or feelings of being left behind. The tragedy is that many people spend more energy rehearsing envy than rehearsing abundance, and so they unconsciously multiply the very lack they resent. Yet the solution is simple. Every time you feel tempted to compare, turn it into an inner affirmation of unity by assuming, what I admire in them I already have in me. And in that moment, you claim their success as evidence of your own unfolding wealth. This is not about ignoring others, but about refusing to let their story write your script, because your imagination is the only author of your experience, and to hand it over to comparisons is to let someone else live your life for you. When you shift this, when you stop measuring yourself against others and start assuming the fullness of your own wealth, you step out of the role of the beggar at someone else's feast and realize you have always been the host of your own table. And so the deeper truth emerges. Comparisons are a confession of lack, but assumption is the declaration of wealth. And when you replace envy with imaginal ownership, the world quickly proves that you were never behind at all, only delayed by the inner conversation you ignored. You may not realize how deeply the belief that there is never enough has lodged itself in your identity, but Neville Goddard taught that this sense of scarcity is not a condition imposed by the outside world. It is a state you carry within, and the moment you accept it as part of who you are, your subconscious ensures that every circumstance, opportunity, and interaction confirms it. When you think of yourself as someone who struggles, someone who never seems to get ahead, someone who always falls short, you are not merely observing reality, you are declaring an assumption, and that assumption solidifies into a life lived in lack. Every time you tell yourself silently, I don't have enough, or money is hard to come by for people like me, You reinforce the identity of scarcity, and your subconscious, loyal to that declaration, continues to arrange events that mirror it, ensuring consistency between who you believe you are and what you experience. The painful irony is that you act as if the scarcity is a punishment from life or a flaw in circumstances, when in truth, it is simply a reflection of your unexamined inner conversation, one that you have allowed to dominate your consciousness. But the moment you catch yourself and deliberately speak to your imagination as though you already have abundance, your identity begins to shift. You begin to sense yourself as someone for whom wealth is normal, effortless, and expected. Imagine the transformation when you consistently assume the state of "I always have enough" and allow the feeling of security, confidence, and satisfaction to permeate every thought, because in that state, your subconscious can no longer arrange experiences that contradict the self it now recognizes. Neville emphasized that identity precedes reality. You cannot claim abundance in your life while assuming poverty in your being, because the world outside is simply a mirror reflecting the inner you. Therefore, the journey to wealth is a journey of inner transformation, a deliberate rewriting of the assumptions that have quietly defined your life so far. Once you begin to live in the consciousness of plenty, even the smallest financial victories become evidence that the new identity is real, reinforcing the inner conversation until it dominates all previous notions of lack. And as this story continues to unfold, you start to see that your struggle was never about circumstances, opportunities, or talent, but about the hidden identity you carried silently, faithfully, producing a life that matches your inner dialogue, until you finally decide to assume differently and allow the world to respond to the person you have chosen to be. You may not notice it, but your subconscious mind is fiercely loyal to the identity you have unconsciously cultivated. And Neville Goddard revealed that this loyalty is the reason why, despite all your efforts, money seems to slip through your fingers, because it obeys the inner conversation you have fed it over years, rather than the temporary desires you voice consciously. Every time you react with fear, doubt, or worry about finances, your subconscious hears the repeated message of struggle and reinforces it, arranging circumstances, people, and events to match that inner assumption without complaint or hesitation. Even when you try new strategies, read books, or attend seminars on wealth, the subconscious will only support those actions that are consistent with the identity you have accepted as yourself, which is why many people end up frustrated. They work hard externally, but internally, they are still rehearsing poverty. Imagine that the secret to changing your life is not in more effort, more information, or more hustle, but in quietly, persistently shifting the inner conversation so that it aligns with wealth and abundance, because your outer life cannot help but follow where your inner reality leads. Neville emphasized that the subconscious is obedient to your assumed state, and until that state is changed, all attempts at financial success are like planting seeds in soil that has already rejected them. Think about how many times you have given yourself permission to feel small, powerless, or incapable in financial matters, and realize that every such allowance has been recorded, honored, and expressed by your subconscious with perfect fidelity. But the moment you begin to assume the opposite, that you are capable, resourceful, and naturally aligned with wealth, the subconscious cannot refuse. It begins to orchestrate evidence of your new identity in ways both subtle and profound. It may start with small synchronicities, unexpected opportunities, or effortless solutions to problems that once seemed insurmountable, and gradually your external world reshapes itself to match the inner reality you have cultivated. This is the hidden mechanism behind wealth. It is not merely about acquiring money, it is about establishing an inner identity so thoroughly that the outer world is compelled to follow. And as you persist in speaking the language of abundance to yourself, silently and without hesitation, your subconscious becomes your most faithful ally, reshaping circumstances to align with the new script you have chosen. What once seemed like endless struggle now begins to feel like a natural progression toward ease, success, and financial freedom. Because the subconscious cannot distinguish between imagination and reality. It only obeys your assumed state, and through that obedience, it produces a life consistent with your chosen inner conversation. You may not realize how often your inner conversation sabotages opportunities in the smallest moments, like standing in a store contemplating a purchase. Because Neville Goddard taught that every scenario, no matter how mundane, is a stage for assumption, and the words you speak silently to yourself dictate whether you experience scarcity or abundance. When you see something you desire, and your first thought is, "I can't afford this," or "maybe later," you are not just making a decision about money. You are silently affirming a state of lack that your subconscious will faithfully bring into your life in countless ways. Imagine instead if, in that exact moment, your inner voice said, "I always have enough for everything I need and desire," and you allowed that feeling of sufficiency to saturate your consciousness. Because that small adjustment, repeated countless times, becomes a powerful lever for reshaping your financial reality. Neville emphasized that life mirrors your inner assumptions, so even the act of imagining yourself easily affording that item or experiencing satisfaction after acquiring it strengthens the state of abundance in your subconscious. The genius of this approach is that you do not have to wait for large opportunities to feel wealthy. You can practice wealth in the small choices, the everyday encounters, and the private conversations that are happening inside your mind at every moment. When you consistently shift your self-talk from limitation to abundance, you begin to notice subtle changes. You make better choices, attract supportive people, and find solutions that previously seemed impossible. This is the practical power of the inner conversation. Small adjustments accumulate, and life begins to bend toward the state you assume as real. Consider how liberating it is to walk through the world with the certainty that you always have enough, that you are always provided for, and that wealth flows to you effortlessly because your inner dialogue has become a channel for abundance rather than a trap of scarcity. Neville's insight was that the mundane is where the miraculous begins, because every inner word is a command, and every command is obeyed. When you consistently imagine and speak to yourself as someone who already has enough, even in the most ordinary situations, you cultivate a subconscious expectation of wealth that eventually manifests in extraordinary ways. And so, as you move through daily life, you realize that nothing outside you has ultimate control. It is the private, silent dialogue that determines whether life is a mirror of struggle or a reflection of abundance. You may not realize how pivotal the first moments of your day are, but Neville Goddard taught that your morning inner conversations set the tone for the entire unfolding of your reality. Because whatever assumptions you establish first thing in the mind act like seeds planted in fertile soil that the subconscious will nurture throughout the day. The moment you wake and begin speaking silently to yourself, whether it is, "I'll never catch up," or "I don't have enough time or money," you are laying the groundwork for a day that mirrors those beliefs, and the outside world will faithfully reflect them back to you in subtle and obvious ways alike. But imagine shifting those first inner words to affirm abundance. "I always have enough. I am aligned with prosperity. Everything I desire comes to me effortlessly." And letting that feeling permeate your body and mind, because Neville emphasized that it is not the words alone, but the feeling behind them that impresses the subconscious and compels it to act. When you consistently greet each day with a mental rehearsal of wealth and sufficiency, even before any external action is taken, the entire day begins to conform to that assumption, attracting opportunities, synchronicities, and effortless solutions that align perfectly with your inner state. Think about the contrast between waking with worry, scarcity, or self-doubt versus waking with certainty, gratitude, and the quiet knowledge that you already have everything you need. The difference is not superficial. It determines the quality of every interaction, every decision, and every chance encounter that will occur. Neville's genius was in showing that wealth is cultivated in the mind first. And by consciously directing the morning inner conversation, you are not only choosing the tone of your day, but the trajectory of your life. Even small habitual thoughts, if repeated at the start of each day, become powerful scripts that the subconscious obeys unquestioningly, reinforcing either lack or abundance depending on your choice. By consistently assuming the reality of your desire at the moment you awaken, you align your actions, speech, and perceptions with wealth, even if nothing external has changed yet. And so, as the story unfolds further, it becomes clear that mornings are the most potent laboratory for rehearsing and living in the state you wish to experience. Because the subconscious, loyal to the first impressions it receives each day, will diligently orchestrate circumstances that mirror the assumptions you plant in those initial moments. You may not realize how powerful your state just before sleep is, but Neville Goddard taught that the moments when you are drowsy, half awake, and ready to drift into sleep are the perfect opportunity to impress your subconscious with the reality you desire. Because the mind in this state is highly receptive and cannot distinguish between imagined and real experiences. When you lie in bed and allow yourself to visualize, in rich detail, having the money you need, enjoying the lifestyle you want, or feeling the relief of financial freedom, you are not daydreaming. You are planting seeds that your subconscious will cultivate without resistance. Imagine replaying a scene where you check your bank account and see the exact amount you wish for, or opening an envelope to find a check for an unexpected source, and letting yourself feel the satisfaction, security, and joy as if it were happening now, because Neville emphasized that feeling is the secret, and the subconscious cannot ignore such vivid, emotionally charged assumption. Nightly practice of this sort, often referred to as SATs, state akin to sleep, quietly reprograms the mind to accept wealth as your natural state, and over time, the outer world bends to match the inner reality you have rehearsed. Many people fail to achieve financial success, not because they lack intelligence or opportunity, but because they ignore this simple yet profound technique, allowing their subconscious to continue echoing scarcity instead of abundance. Even small, consistent efforts in this state accumulate like compound interest in the subconscious, gradually altering habits, perceptions, and reactions so that money begins to flow effortlessly. Picture ending each day not with worry, regret, or frustration, but with the calm certainty that all your financial needs are already met. And notice how life begins to respond, aligning events, people, and circumstances to reflect the inner scene you have made real. This is why Neville insisted that imagination, applied with feeling at the threshold of sleep, is the ultimate creative tool, because the mind is most pliable at that hour, absorbing the seeds of assumption without opposition from rational thought. And as you continue to practice this method, you begin to sense a quiet transformation. Unexpected opportunities arise, solutions appear without effort, and your financial life begins to feel inevitable, as if the universe itself has acknowledged your inner certainty. The deeper truth emerges that the state in which you fall asleep is the seedbed for your waking reality. And by taking control of your imagination at this crucial moment, you are no longer subject to circumstances, but are, instead, the conscious author of every unfolding detail. You may not realize how much influence your silent conversations with others carry, but Neville Goddard taught that even when words are not spoken aloud, the imagination of how people respond to you creates a reality that your subconscious will faithfully bring into being. Because the mind does not distinguish between imagined interactions and actual events. When you find yourself rehearsing in your mind how someone might criticize, reject, or ignore you, you are unconsciously preparing your world to reflect that very outcome, and the more vivid and emotionally charged the rehearsal, the faster it manifests. But imagine instead quietly picturing friends, colleagues, or strangers congratulating you on your financial success, admiring your achievements, or expressing gratitude for your generosity, and allowing yourself to feel the satisfaction and pride of those imagined responses as real, because this inner conversation trains your subconscious to arrange circumstances and people to match your assumptions. Neville emphasized that the world is a mirror, reflecting not what you wish for, but the state you carry internally. And by mentally rehearsing approval, recognition, and admiration, you invite those exact experiences into your life. Think of the subtle power of imagining a client thanking you for providing a solution, a partner acknowledging your resourcefulness, or a family member expressing pride in your accomplishments. because these rehearsed interactions shape the outer reality without anyone knowing you have directed it. Silent conversations with others are not trivial. They are potent declarations of who you assume yourself to be. And when consistently aligned with wealth and abundance, they reinforce your inner identity as a prosperous person. Every imagined word, gesture, or tone contributes to the script your subconscious obeys, and once the script shifts toward affirmation, the world rearranges naturally, often in ways you could not consciously plan. This is why Neville urged students to monitor their imagination continuously, even in social situations, because what you silently assume in response to others' actions has the power to create opportunities, attract resources, and open doors that logic alone cannot. And as you begin to master these quiet conversations, you realize that true wealth is not just about money. It is about the network of interactions, approvals, and mutual acknowledgement that flows effortlessly when your inner dialogue consistently assumes abundance. In this way, the subtle art of imagining how others perceive and respond to you becomes a cornerstone of manifesting wealth. Because the outer world must eventually align with the inner reality you persistently rehearse. You may not realize how transformative it can be to live rich in your imagination before your outer circumstances reflect it. But Neville Goddard taught that the inner state of having already achieved your desire is the only thing that guarantees its external fulfillment, because the world will always conform to the identity you assume within. When you imagine yourself dining at the restaurants you desire, driving the car you long for, or handling money with ease and confidence, you are not playing a game. You are rehearsing a state that your subconscious takes as reality, and from that reality the outer world cannot help but adjust. Think about how often people wait for wealth to arrive before feeling wealthy, only to perpetuate a cycle of lack, because their inner conversations are still steeped in worry, doubt, and limitation, which the subconscious faithfully mirrors back in circumstances. But when you shift the inner narrative to assume abundance first, the world responds as if it were catching up to the life you have already claimed internally. Neville emphasized that all creation begins in the imagination, and by consistently living in the end, the feeling of being wealthy, you plant a seed so real that the subconscious orchestrates its manifestation in events, people, and opportunities. Every thought, every imagined scene of prosperity, every internal dialogue of confidence strengthens the identity of a person who naturally attracts wealth, and the outer world soon becomes a reflection of that inner state. Imagine waking each day already satisfied, already secure, already abundant, because your imagination has trained the subconscious to operate from that reality, and suddenly your choices, decisions, and even chance encounters align effortlessly with the assumption you have lived. This is why Neville insisted that assumption is not a wish, it is a command, and to live in the state of having what you desire is to issue that command in the language your subconscious always obeys. The remarkable effect is that life begins to move in your favor, without struggle, delays, or desperation, because the inner world has been primed to accept and reflect prosperity. By living rich in imagination first, you are no longer dependent on external validation or timing. You create a reality that honors the person you have chosen to be internally. And as this journey continues, you begin to understand that the outer world is not the source of wealth. It is merely the canvas upon which your assumed state paints the masterpiece of your financial life. You may not notice it, but every negative word you whisper to yourself about money, every doubt, every worry, and every inner complaint eventually crystallizes into real-life obstacles, because Neville Goddard taught that the subconscious does not differentiate between imagination and reality. It simply obeys the assumptions it is fed. When you silently repeat, "I can't pay this bill," or "I'll never get ahead," you are not just expressing frustration, you are issuing commands that organize circumstances to reflect that belief. And soon enough, the world produces the evidence your inner conversation has already assumed. Think about it. The mounting bills, the unexpected expenses, the delays in payment. These are rarely random. They are the manifestations of repeated inner affirmations of lack that you have been rehearsing without awareness. But imagine turning that inner dialogue around, silently telling yourself, everything I need is provided, and all bills are paid with ease, and feeling the relief, certainty, and sufficiency as if it has already happened. Because in that shift, your subconscious begins arranging events to match the new assumption. Neville emphasized that your outer life is a faithful reflection of your inner world, and until the inner conversation changes, no external effort can permanently alter the pattern of financial struggle. Every worry is a blueprint, every fear a scaffold, and every complaint a seed that grows into circumstances. The bills, debts, and shortages are simply the physical manifestations of an unexamined inner state. But when you consciously redirect your inner speech to assume abundance, your subconscious engineers solutions, opportunities, and unexpected ways to cover needs, often with astonishing precision. Imagine living each day with the calm certainty that all financial obligations are already met, and letting that feeling guide every decision, interaction, and action. This is the practical application of Neville's teachings, transforming invisible thought into tangible reality. The outer world responds not to hope, effort, or desperation, but to the confident inner assumption that abundance is already yours. And the more emotionally real you make it in your imagination, the faster the external proof appears. And as this understanding deepens, you begin to see that negative self-talk is never just harmless musing. It is the hidden architect of every bill and shortage you have ever faced. And once you take responsibility for it, you hold the key to creating effortless wealth. You may not realize it, but hoping for wealth is not the same as assuming it. And Neville Goddard made it clear that hoping actually blocks having, because hope implies a gap between desire and reality, a tension that tells your subconscious that abundance is not yet yours. And until that gap is closed internally, the outer world remains faithful to the inner division. When you say silently, "I hope this works out," or "I hope I get the money," you are not declaring ownership. You are creating a state of waiting, of longing, and the subconscious can only mirror that waiting with delay, struggle, and uncertainty. Imagine instead assuming fully, with conviction and feeling, that wealth is already yours, that bills are paid, and that opportunities are unfolding exactly as they should, because assumption leaves no gap for doubt, worry, or hope. And it compels the subconscious to act as if the desired state is an already established fact. Neville emphasized that the subconscious cannot distinguish between imagined reality and sensory reality, and it moves to fulfill whatever you accept as true in the present moment, which is why assumption is far more powerful than hoping. Every hope is an acknowledgement of absence, a subtle confession that what you want has not yet materialized, and until you eliminate that admission, the world cannot deliver the proof you seek. But when you shift from hoping to assuming, your inner conversation changes from passive longing to active ownership, and suddenly the universe begins to provide, not in random fragments, but in alignment with the reality you have already accepted. Think about it. Hoping is like planting seeds without water, waiting for rain that may never come, while assuming is like planting, watering, and nourishing the seeds until they flourish into the desired harvest. The moment you replace hope with the lived feeling of possession, your subconscious orchestrates circumstances, people, and events to conform perfectly to that assumption, and what once seemed distant and improbable begins to arrive naturally and effortlessly. This is why Neville insisted that wealth is not something to be hoped for. It is something to be assumed, and the outer world is merely the reflection of the inner state you persistently maintain. And as you continue on this path, you begin to see that hope is the subtle enemy of manifestation, while assumption, when combined with feeling, is the silent force that transforms imagination into reality, proving once again that the inner conversation you cultivate is far more consequential than any external effort. You may not realize it, but wealth is not a distant goal, a prize to be earned, or a reward for effort. Neville Goddard taught that wealth is your natural state, and the only reason you do not experience it is because your inner conversation contradicts it, silently insisting that lack is normal, that struggle is inevitable, and that abundance must be chased rather than assumed. When you carry thoughts of limitation, whether it is, "I never have enough," or "money is hard to get," You are denying your natural inheritance, and your subconscious faithfully constructs a life that mirrors that denial. Imagine instead living from the assumption that wealth is not exceptional, but ordinary for you, that you are always provided for, always capable of handling what comes, and always in the flow of prosperity. Because once you accept this inner reality, your outer circumstances begin to align effortlessly, proving the truth of what you assume. Neville emphasized that everything in life is first created in the imagination, and by consistently rehearsing wealth as normal, natural, and expected, you reprogram the subconscious to operate in harmony with that state, and the world responds accordingly. Think about how liberating it is to internalize that abundance is not a prize to pursue, but a condition to inhabit. Because once the inner conversation reflects that understanding, fear, doubt, and struggle no longer hold sway. Every choice, every action, and every opportunity becomes filtered through the lens of plenty rather than scarcity, and you begin to move through life with ease, confidence, and a quiet certainty that what you need is always available. This is why Neville taught that living rich in imagination first creates a natural magnetism. The subconscious recognizes the state as truth and faithfully arranges the outer world to match it. Even setbacks, delays, or apparent obstacles no longer threaten your assumption of wealth, because your inner conversation has established a foundation that is unshakable and self-validating. By claiming abundance as your normal state, you stop being at the mercy of external circumstances and start being the conscious author of your financial life, and the universe mirrors back the reality you have assumed with perfect fidelity. And as you continue, you begin to sense that the true work of wealth is not accumulating money, but aligning your thoughts, feelings, and inner dialogue with the reality of prosperity that is already yours, revealing that the state of abundance has been waiting inside you all along, merely awaiting acknowledgement. You may not realize it, but there are silent forces at work within you, subtle currents of thought and feeling that Neville Goddard described as the true architects of your reality. Because the inner conversation you maintain, often without awareness, commands the subconscious to arrange every circumstance, every opportunity, and every challenge in perfect accordance with the assumptions you harbor. When you ignore these forces, when you let worry, doubt, and fear dominate your private dialogue, you are unknowingly submitting to them, and they respond with circumstances that mirror the poverty, struggle, or limitation you have silently accepted as reality. Imagine, however, if you consciously chose to align these silent forces with wealth, imagining yourself already abundant, satisfied, and secure, and allowing that feeling to saturate your being. Because once the inner conversation fully supports a new assumption, the subconscious has no choice but to orchestrate events that validate it. Neville emphasized that imagination, feeling, and assumption are the invisible instruments through which reality is molded. And once you learn to direct them deliberately, the world responds with remarkable precision. Every thought, every inner word, every fleeting emotional reaction contributes to the blueprint your subconscious follows, which is why unnoticed habits of thinking often explain why wealth eludes most people, even those who outwardly appear capable and determined. But when you bring attention to these silent forces and deliberately program them with the assumption of abundance, you effectively transform the unseen mechanisms that govern life, and your outer circumstances begin to reflect this new order. Consider how liberating it is to realize that no outside circumstance has ultimate power over you. It is your unseen inner dialogue that shapes outcomes, attracts opportunities, and determines success or failure. As you practice this awareness, you start noticing the ways life bends to your assumptions. Unexpected payments arrive, doors open effortlessly, and people respond in alignment with your assumed state, all because the silent forces within have been redirected. The deeper truth emerges. Obedience to old habits of thought produces limitation, while conscious alignment with inner assumptions produces wealth, proving that the life you desire has always been within reach, waiting for your inner conversation to acknowledge it. And as this understanding solidifies, you realize that mastery over these invisible forces is the ultimate key to financial freedom, because the outer world, cannot help but mirror the inner reality you steadfastly maintain. You may not realize it, but the final secret to wealth is not chasing it, not striving for it, and not waiting for external proof, but becoming it internally. Because Neville Goddard taught that when you assume the state of having, being, and living as a wealthy person, the outer world has no choice but to reflect that reality, perfectly and inevitably. Every inner conversation, every imagined scene, and every feeling of sufficiency contributes to the creation of your outer circumstances. And once you live as wealth itself in thought, feeling, and assumption, there's nothing left to acquire. Wealth becomes your natural expression. Imagine walking through your day not hoping for opportunities, not worrying about lack, but moving with the certainty, ease, and confidence of someone who is already rich, because that inner state magnetizes events, people, and situations to align seamlessly with your assumed identity. Neville emphasized that this is not fantasy or wishful thinking. It is the conscious act of living in the end, embodying the reality you desire, and allowing the subconscious to orchestrate the details without resistance. When you stop seeing wealth as something outside yourself and start inhabiting it as your very being, every action you take, every choice you make, and every interaction you have becomes a natural extension of abundance. The outer world, in turn, responds to the identity you carry rather than the efforts you expend, proving that chasing money is futile when the inner state has already been established. Think about the liberation of no longer being at the mercy of circumstances, no longer measuring yourself against others, and no longer hoping for relief, because you have become the embodiment of the prosperity you seek. This is why Neville insisted that assumption, imagination, and feeling are the true currencies of creation. They determine the life you live far more reliably than effort, strategy, or timing. And as this story of inner transformation concludes, you see that wealth has never been an external prize to capture. It has always been a reflection of the person you are willing to become in your inner conversations. A state that, once assumed, must manifest without delay. By becoming wealth rather than chasing it, you finally align every silent thought, every feeling, and every assumption with abundance, and the universe mirrors that identity with perfect fidelity, proving that the inner conversation you choose to cultivate is the ultimate key to a life of effortless prosperity, fulfillment, and freedom.